On that cold Monday morning, Sarah Thompson woke up before the sun rose. The alarm clock didn't even need to ring. Anxiety did the job for her. She got up slowly, feeling the weight of the day ahead. In the next room, her 3 children were still asleep, oblivious to the approaching hurricane. She watched them for a moment, memorizing every detail: the messy curls of Ava, Malik's calm breathing, and Noah's little way of tucking his feet under the blanket. She took a deep breath, mentally repeating the lawyer's words. "It will be quick, just a misunderstanding." With that thought in her head, she headed to the bathroom, washed her face, and got dressed. She chose her best navy blue dress, the one she wore to job interviews and important school meetings. She wanted to look strong, dignified, despite the tight knot in her stomach. The courthouse building was enormous, imposing, built to intimidate. Sarah entered through the main door, clutching her purse against her chest as if it could protect her heart from the sentence awaiting her. The public defender met her in the corridor, a thin, pale man who looked as though he'd been pulled from bed just 5 minutes earlier. He hurriedly flipped through some papers, muttering something about an overload of cases and too little time. "Everything will be fine. It's just a documentation error," he assured her, not even looking into her eyes. Sarah only nodded, trying to ignore the growing feeling that something was terribly wrong. The corridors were crowded, the low murmur of conversations blending with the sound of hurried footsteps. Then, the courtroom door opened, and she was called in. With one last glance back, she entered the room where her life was about to be redefined. The courtroom was a sterile, suffocating space, with faded beige walls and a high ceiling that echoed every sound. The air carried a mixed odor of stale coffee and old paper. At the back of the room, a few chairs were occupied by strangers, casual onlookers to everyday tragedies. Sarah felt her heart race as she saw Judge William Harrison seated behind the imposing dark wooden bench. He didn't even have to speak for his presence to command attention. His cold, almost bored gaze swept the room before settling on her. A look that saw not a mother, a worker, or a daughter caring for her elderly mother, but just another case to be dismissed. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. Her lawyer cleared his throat, adjusted his papers, and began presenting the defense. It was an administrative error, a trivial mix-up. The medications belonged to Sarah's mother, who had been taking them for years, but due to a mistake, they were stored in a different bottle, unlabeled. Sarah had no intention of breaking any law. It was a simple misunderstanding, something that could be resolved with a warning or, at worst, a fine. But Judge Harrison remained impassive, his eyes half closed, as if he already knew the sentence even before hearing the arguments. Then he spoke. Harrison's voice cut through the air like a sharp scalpel, every word laced with barely concealed contempt. "You expect me to believe that you simply carried controlled substances without even realizing it?" he said, with a tone of feigned incredulity. Sarah's lawyer tried to interject, arguing that the medication was legitimate and there was no criminal intent. But Harrison completely ignored him, focusing solely on her. "Drugs without a prescription are a serious crime. If we allow exceptions, we open dangerous precedents." A murmur of unease rippled through the room as Sarah felt the color drain from her face. She tried to speak, to explain that she was taking care of her mother and would never do anything illegal. But the words died in her throat before they could emerge. Then came the final blow. Given the defendant's history, the gravity of the infraction, and the need to set an example for society, I impose a sentence of life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole in 25 years. The ensuing silence was overwhelming. Sarah's world spun, as if the ground had been ripped from beneath her feet. Her lawyer's eyes widened in disbelief. Someone in the audience gasped. But Harrison simply struck his gavel and stood up, as if he had just settled a trivial matter. Sarah tried to breathe, but the air seemed to have vanished from the room. She heard the clatter of handcuffs being prepared, even before she could understand that this was not a nightmare from which she might wake. The metallic weight of the handcuffs snapping around Sarah's wrists was as shocking as the sentence itself. The cold of the steel against her skin seemed to mock the feverish heat consuming her body. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she was paralyzed, unable to process what had just happened. The voices around her became a distant hum, as if she was submerged in water. Her lawyer mumbled incoherent protests, but by then, it didn't matter. Two officers approached, their faces void of emotion, simply following orders. One of them firmly grabbed her arm, forcing her to stand. The sudden movement triggered a burst of panic. This was real. She was being taken away. She looked around, searching for any hint of humanity in the courthouse, someone who would stand up against this atrocity, but no one moved. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth in shock. A man shook his head helplessly, but no one did anything. Not a single voice rose against the absurdity. As she was dragged toward the exit, Sarah tried to say something, but her voice failed her. Her dignity, so carefully preserved throughout her life, was being crushed before everyone's eyes, and no one dared to stop it. In the corridor, the lawyer finally found his voice and ran after them, his briefcase clattering against his hip. "This is an outrage," he protested, breathless. "We're going to appeal immediately. This cannot stand." But the expression on his face betrayed his fear. He knew exactly whom he was up against. Judge Harrison was a name feared behind the scenes of the judicial system. It wasn't just his severity, but the cruel and selective standard of his decisions. He didn't err by accident. He chose. He chose whom to punish, whom to crush. And Sarah, a black woman, a single mother without money for a reputable lawyer, had been an easy choice. The officer escorting her kept his eyes fixed ahead, ignoring the lawyer's words as if they were an insignificant breeze. Sarah felt a knot in her throat, but fought to swallow her despair. "I did nothing wrong," she managed to whisper, more to herself than to anyone else. The lawyer nodded, a gleam of anger in his eyes. "I know, and we're going to prove it." But at that moment, words of comfort were insufficient. Because as she descended the marble steps of the courthouse, Sarah felt that her life had been torn away in a matter of minutes, and no one seemed to have the power to give it back. Outside the courthouse, the air was bitterly cold, but Sarah barely felt the chill. Her mind whirled, trying to comprehend how a simple administrative error had transformed into the complete destruction of her life. The crowd outside was a mix of people hurrying about, unaware that an innocent woman was being taken to a cell for a crime she never committed. The sound of passing cars, honking horns, hurried footsteps, everything seemed distant, muffled by a fog of disbelief and fear. When she reached the police car, Sarah finally saw the reflection of her own face in the dark window. Her eyes were wide, her breathing short, as if she were trapped inside her own body, unable to escape. The door opened, and she was shoved inside. The rough upholstery of the back seat scratched the exposed skin on her arms, and the click of the door closing resounded like a definitive seal on her new reality. Inside, in the isolation of the car, indignation began to form within her, like embers ignited beneath the shock. This could not end like this. The vehicle started moving, and Sarah felt the city blur past her indifferently. With every corner, a piece of her life now seemed unreachable. The supermarket where she bought groceries for her children. The school where Noah, Malik, and Ava learned and played. The laundromat where she always chatted with Mrs. Martinez about life's challenges. Each of these places now felt like part of a world that had been forcefully torn away from her. The officer in the front seat chatted with his partner, indifferent to the chaos boiling inside her. "Did you catch the game yesterday?" one asked. The other laughed. "It was a joke! Horrible team!" Sarah's heart ached. How could the world continue spinning normally while her life was being crushed? She closed her eyes and tried to focus. Her lawyer had said he would appeal, but how long would that take? Days, months, years? Would her children sleep without their mother that night? Would they miss her at breakfast? The question hurt more than any physical blow. Then a new wave of indignation surged within her. No, she wasn't going to accept this. If no one else fought for her, she would fight herself. The patrol car headed toward the county penitentiary, and every mile felt like another step toward the abyss. Sarah tried to control her breathing, to keep her head held high, but inside, the storm was already raging. Suddenly, a thought hit her like a punch to the gut. What if her children found out what had happened before she could even speak to them? What if they saw the news on television, or worse, on the internet, where cruel comments spread like plague? Would they grow up believing that their mother was a criminal, the image of Noah asking for her, not understanding why she wasn't coming home, was enough to bring tears to her eyes? But she blinked rapidly, forcing herself to swallow the sob. No, she would not allow herself to crumble. At least not there, not in the presence of those officers who treated her like just another burden. Her lawyer had promised to appeal, but she knew that the system did not work so quickly for people like her. When the patrol car stopped in front of the prison, Sarah felt her stomach drop. The building's facade was gloomy, designed to crush any hope before one even set foot through the gate. The high bars, the cold concrete and the barbed wire atop the walls formed an overwhelming sight. The officer in the front turned to her and without any emotion said, "Time to get off." The click of the door opening echoed in her ears, and a cold wind brushed against her skin as she stepped onto the rough pavement of the parking lot. Every step she took seemed to steal a piece of her identity, as if, by crossing those gates, she ceased to be Sarah Thompson and became just a number in the system. Yet, even with her wrists bound by handcuffs, even with indignation burning inside her, a spark of determination began to form. If the world had decided that she did not deserve justice, then she would find a way to scream so loud that no one could ignore her. As soon as Sarah crossed the prison gates, the metallic sound of the lock clanging shut behind her sent a chill down her spine. The entrance corridor was a concrete tunnel illuminated by cold, merciless fluorescent lights that seemed to suck any trace of humanity from the surroundings. The officer escorting her gripped her arm with unnecessary force, as if she might try to run at any moment. "Keep your eyes forward and don't talk to anyone," he ordered. Sarah, however, didn't need warnings. Her body was tense, her mind torn between fear and indignation. At a table ahead, a short, sturdy guard with a tired look took her file and began asking routine questions. Name, age, address. Every answer Sarah gave felt like a fragment of her identity being ripped away. Then came the final blow. The guard looked up and pointed to a door at the end of the corridor. "Processing. You will be searched and change your clothes." Sarah tasted the bitter flavor of humiliation even before entering the room. She had heard stories about this moment, about how they stripped the dignity from new arrivals even before locking them behind bars. But experiencing it firsthand was entirely different. She was forced to undress, her fingers trembling as she handed over each piece to the penitentiary officer, who inspected everything with a mechanical gaze. Her navy blue dress, a symbol of her attempt to maintain dignity, was haphazardly folded and tossed into a plastic bag. In its place, she received a beige uniform, rough and cold against her skin. Sarah felt the weight of the clothing as if she were carrying an invisible burden on her shoulders. As she dressed, her mind screamed, "This can't be happening, this can't be real," but it was. And the moment she left that room, she understood that she was no longer seen as a mother, a daughter, or a citizen. To that system, Sarah Thompson had ceased to exist. Sarah was escorted down a long corridor, where the sound of the guards' boots echoed in sync with the rapid beats of her heart. The cells on either side appeared as shadows of a nightmare. Women of various ages and backgrounds looked out through the bars, some with curiosity, others with complete indifference. One of them, a woman whose face was marked by years of imprisonment, let out a low whistle and muttered, "Another one." Sarah felt anger rising, but kept her eyes fixed ahead. She couldn't afford to appear weak. The officer beside her stopped in front of a narrow cell, pushed the door open, and gestured for her to enter. Sarah hesitated for a second, as if her body refused to accept that fate, but she had no choice. She stepped forward, and the door slammed shut behind her with a metallic crash that seemed to seal her destiny. The smell of mold and cheap disinfectant invaded her nostrils, and the sensation of confinement was overwhelming. A metal bed with a thin mattress and a toilet in the corner made up her new world. She sat slowly on the bed, feeling the hard frame creak under her weight. Her eyes roamed the cell, searching for something, anything that could make her feel real, that could remind her of who she was. But there was nothing. The noise around her was a constant chaos of voices, footsteps, and metal doors opening and closing. Sarah pressed her hands against her thighs, trying to control her breathing. Was this how her life would be now? Endless days, trapped in a suffocating routine. The thought was crushing, but then something inside her rebelled. No, she wasn't going to resign herself to it. Her lawyer had said he would appeal. There were people out there who knew this was unjust. She just had to hold on. She had to keep her head up until someone, anyone, managed to get her out of there. The first night was a cruel test. Sarah could barely sleep, not only because of the discomfort of the thin mattress and the stone-hard pillow, but because of the crushing weight of uncertainty. The noise never ceased. Heavy footsteps of guards patrolling the corridors, hushed whispers among inmates, occasional distant screams echoing through the prison. Every sound made her wonder, what if I never get out of here? Fear crawled like a starving animal, ready to devour her. But whenever despair threatened to take over, she forced herself to think of her children. Malik loved building cities with his blocks. Ava danced in the living room as if she were on a grand stage. Noah held her hand tightly when crossing the street. Sarah clung to those memories like a lifeboat amid the storm. They needed her. She couldn't lose herself in there. The next morning, the prison routine began without concession. A guard banged on the bars with a baton, waking everyone up at once. "Up! It's breakfast time!" Sarah got up slowly, feeling the weight of a night without rest. Breakfast was a shock to reality. A plastic tray with something that looked like thin porridge, a dry piece of bread, and a cup of watery coffee. The smell of food mixed with the moldy odor of the walls turned her stomach. Around her, the inmates ate in silence or whispered among themselves. A woman next to her, her skin adorned with tattoos running up her neck, observed her for a moment before saying, "First time here?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. The woman let out a short laugh. "You'll learn fast. This place forgives no one." Sarah felt a lump tighten in her throat, but maintained a firm expression. She didn't belong there, but until she could prove otherwise, she had to survive. Sarah soon realized that in prison, everything was a matter of survival. The food was scant and poor, the rules were harsh, and worst of all, the waiting was endless. Every minute dragged on like an eternity, as if time had lost all meaning. She spent the day observing, learning, trying to understand the dynamics of that place. Some women kept to themselves, others formed small groups, and some, clearly, were dangerous. Sarah didn't want trouble, but she also knew she couldn't afford to appear weak. Late in the afternoon, while sitting in a corner of the yard, she felt a shadow approaching. When she looked up, she saw a tall inmate with dark skin and a cold stare standing before her. "You're the newbie," the woman said, crossing her arms. "What did you do to end up here?" Sarah hesitated. How could she explain something so absurd without sounding fragile? "Judicial error," she replied simply. The woman let out a dry laugh. "That's what everyone says." Tension hung in the air for a few seconds. Sarah didn't avert her gaze, even though her heart was racing internally. She knew this moment was a test. In prison, showing fear was opening the door to being crushed. The woman, seemingly satisfied with Sarah's posture, tilted her head and gave a half smile. "I'll give you a piece of advice. Stay away from trouble. In here, if you don't learn quickly, you won't last long." With that, she walked away, leaving Sarah with the weight of a truth she was just beginning to understand. It wasn't enough to just wait for justice. Until it came, if it ever did, Sarah would have to find a way to keep her dignity intact. She needed to be strong, not just for herself, but for the children who still believed their mother would return home. On the second day, Sarah realized that the prison was a machine designed to grind away every trace of hope. Everything was programmed, mechanical, as if the inmates were merely disposable parts within a cold and ruthless system. Meals came at the same scheduled times, roll calls were made with surgical precision, and yard time was just a break before another cycle of tedium and despair. But the worst part was the lack of control. Out there in the real world, Sarah was a mother, a daughter with responsibilities. In here, she was just a number, and that was killing her inside. After lunch, she was called to the administrative wing. Her lawyer wanted to speak with her. The moment she heard this, her heart skipped a beat. Perhaps there was some news. Maybe finally someone had recognized the absurdity of her situation. When Sarah entered the visitation room, she found her lawyer sitting on the other side of a glass partition, shoulders tense and eyes showing evident exhaustion. He picked up the phone and waited for her to do the same. "We have a problem," he said bluntly. The appeal was denied. The words hit Sarah like an avalanche. For a moment, she felt everything around her distort. "What?" she managed to murmur. The lawyer ran his hand over his face, frustrated. They claimed there was not enough reason to review the sentence, that Judge Harrison acted within the parameters of the law. Sarah gripped the phone tightly, feeling anger boiling beneath her skin. "This can't be happening." The lawyer took a deep breath. "There are still options. We can take the case to the press. We can pressure other authorities, but I need you to hold on. The fight is going to be long." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to muster the strength to continue. She couldn't afford to collapse. Not now. Sarah left the visitation room feeling the crushing weight of hopelessness on her shoulders. The only thing keeping her upright was the idea that it would all be resolved quickly. But now reality was a bottomless pit. She returned to her cell in silence, ignoring the curious glances of the other inmates. She sat on the hard bed and pressed her hands against her temples, trying to organize her thoughts. If justice wouldn't come to her, she would have to find it herself. But how? Outside, the world continued to turn, while inside those walls, everything seemed frozen. It was then that she heard a whisper coming from the cell next door. "Hey, newbie." Sarah looked toward the bars and saw the same tattooed woman who had given her the warning the day before. "I heard your case is a big joke." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean by that?" The woman shrugged. "I mean, Judge Harrison doesn't exactly have a clean reputation. If someone digs into his dirty laundry, you might get out of here sooner than you think." Sarah's heart began to race. That information was valuable, but could it be trusted? "How do you know that?" she asked, keeping her voice low. The woman laughed, but not in a friendly way. "Girl, do you really think this place is made up only of criminals? There are people here who know more about the system than the judges themselves. Believe me, Harrison has many skeletons in his closet." Sarah swallowed hard. If it were true, this might be her only chance. But how could she do anything from inside the prison? Her lawyer was already pursuing legal avenues, and they weren't working. What was left? Then an idea began to form in her mind. The press. If the story reached the right people, if the judge's corruption came to light, maybe her freedom wouldn't depend solely on bureaucracies. For the first time since she had been locked up, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. That night, Sarah spent hours with her eyes wide open, staring at the cell ceiling while her mind worked non-stop. If there was a way to expose Judge Harrison, she needed to find out how. But to do that, she would have to communicate with someone on the outside. Her lawyer was already trying the legal route, but that wouldn't be enough. She needed the press. She needed someone willing to unveil the truth without fear of retribution. But who? Then she remembered a name. Maria Sant, the investigative journalist who a few years ago had taken down a corruption scheme within the city police department. Sarah didn't know her personally, but she knew that if anyone could dig deep into this story, it would be her. The problem was how to reach Maria. Phone access in prison was limited, and her lawyer would probably say that exposing the case to the media could complicate matters. But Sarah knew she had no other option. The next morning, as the inmates were being taken to breakfast, Sarah approached the tattooed woman who had given her the tip the previous night. "You said there are people in here who know how things work," she began in a low voice. "Can someone help me get in touch with the press?" The woman raised an eyebrow, assessing Sarah for a moment. "Maybe," she replied, crossing her arms. "But nothing here is free." Sarah held her breath. She knew that favors inside prison always had a price. But whatever it was, it couldn't be worse than spending the rest of her life in there. "What do you want?" The woman gave a sly smile. "Nothing major. I just need you to deliver a message to someone during your next phone call." Sarah hesitated. It reeked of trouble, but she had no choice. "Deal," she said, trying not to show her nervousness. If that meant a chance to regain her freedom, she was willing to risk it. That afternoon, Sarah was called for phone time. Her heart pounded as she walked down the narrow corridor, escorted by a guard who seemed only concerned with his routine. When she finally sat before the phone, her hands were sweating. She dialed her lawyer's number, as she always did, but this time, something was different. As soon as he answered, Sarah spoke quickly and quietly. "I need you to contact Maria Sant. She needs to know about my case." There was silence on the other end of the line. "Sarah, I don't know if that's a good idea. The case is already underway." "The case isn't going anywhere," she interrupted, anger rising. "The press might be our only chance." The lawyer sighed, and she knew he was considering it. Before hanging up, Sarah took a deep breath and whispered the message she had promised to deliver. She felt a knot in her stomach as she did so, but she needed that connection. Once she hung up, she knew there was no turning back. The following days were filled with pure tension. Sarah knew that any news could change everything, for better or worse. Every time her name was called by the guards, her heart raced, fearing it might be trouble because of the favor she had asked. But nothing happened. Not yet, until a week later a guard banged on the bars of her cell forcefully. "You have a visitor." Sarah frowned. It wasn't visiting day. When she was escorted to the visitation room, she felt her breath catch when she saw who was waiting for her. Maria Sant herself was sitting on the other side of the glass, with a notepad and a sharp look in her eyes. Sarah picked up the phone with trembling hands. "So," the journalist began, leaning forward, "let's talk about Judge Harrison." Sarah could hardly believe she was there, face to face with Maria Sant. The journalist was known for having no fear in unearthing dangerous truths, and now her eyes were fixed on Sarah, waiting for something worthwhile. "I shouldn't be here," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I was convicted without evidence, without a fair trial. But I'm not the only one." Maria nodded, quickly jotting something down. "I know. I did some research before coming. Your case isn't isolated. Judge Harrison has a record of absurd sentences against minorities. I just need something concrete to put this in the headlines." Sarah swallowed hard. She knew this was her chance, but she had nothing except her word. "Someone in here told me that Harrison isn't as clean as he seems, that there's dirt, that he's been accused of discrimination before." Maria paused her writing for a moment, squinting. "That's exactly what I needed to hear. If I can get proof, I promise your case won't be ignored." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She knew that provoking someone like Judge Harrison was dangerous, but what was the alternative? Spend the rest of her life in prison for a crime she never committed. "What do I do now?" she asked, trying to control her anxiety. Maria smiled faintly. "Leave it to me. I'll pull some strings and find out everything I can about him. But you need to stay strong. There might be reprisals." Sarah nodded, knowing she was treading on dangerous ground. As soon as the visit ended, she was escorted back to her cell, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. For the first time since her conviction, she felt that maybe there was a way out. But she also knew that when the dust started to settle, Judge Harrison wouldn't just stand by. In the following days, Sarah sensed a shift in the atmosphere within the prison. Something was happening out there, and she knew Maria Sant must be at work. Conversations in the dining hall seemed tenser. The guards looked at her differently, as if they knew her story was gaining attention. Then, on Thursday afternoon, during the routine roll call, a guard stopped in front of her cell and banged on the bars. "Thompson, come with me." His tone didn't indicate much, but Sarah felt a chill down her spine. As she walked down the corridor, the eyes of the other inmates followed her. Someone whispered, "I think she messed with the wrong people." Sarah held her head high, trying not to show fear. When she reached the warden's office, she found her lawyer waiting for her, his expression laden with urgency. "Things have escalated, Sarah," he said bluntly. "Maria published the report, and now very powerful people are paying attention to your case." Sarah sat down slowly, trying to absorb his words. "What does that mean?" Her lawyer took a deep breath, looking at the papers in front of him. "It means that Judge Harrison is under scrutiny. Maria's piece revealed a pattern of racial discrimination in his rulings. Not only that, but she obtained internal documents showing that he manipulated evidence and influenced sentences against minorities." Sarah's heart raced. "And can that get me out of here?" Her lawyer nodded, though his face still showed caution. "Yes, but not immediately. The prosecutor's office is reviewing your case, and there's public pressure for a new hearing. The problem is that Harrison still wields influence. He'll try to keep this from going further." Sarah swallowed hard. She was closer to freedom than she had ever been, yet also more vulnerable. She knew that the judge wouldn't let this battle be won easily. That night, Sarah could barely sleep. Every noise in the prison seemed more menacing than ever. If Harrison still had power, he might try to silence the truth, and she was the living proof of the injustice he had perpetuated. At breakfast, even the other inmates seemed restless. Some whispered, others looked at her with expressions ranging from admiration to apprehension. It was then that the tattooed woman, the same one who had given her the first hint about Harrison, sat next to her. "You made some noise out there, huh?" she said, idly stirring her food. Sarah only nodded. "That means you have to be careful. When the big shots start falling, they try to drag others down with them." Sarah looked at her, trying to determine whether it was a warning or a threat. The woman tilted her head. "I've known many who tried to fight the system. Some succeeded, others disappeared before they even got the chance." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. There was no doubt she was treading on dangerous ground. The next day, while in the prison yard, a group of guards came straight toward her. Sarah's heart pounded. "Thompson," one said emotionlessly, "gather your things." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Her first thought was that something terrible was about to happen, but then she noticed something different in the guards' eyes. There was no hostility, just professionalism. They weren't there to punish her, they were there to take her out. Her lawyer had said that public pressure was growing, but Sarah never imagined things would move so fast. As she walked down the corridor, her legs trembled. Was this real, or just another trap? But then, around the final corner, she saw her lawyer waiting for her alongside two officers who looked like they were from a higher authority. "Sarah," he said, smiling for the first time since it all began, "you're getting out of here." Sarah felt her legs give way. For a moment, she stood there, frozen, trying to process those words. "Getting out?" she repeated, as if she needed to hear it again to believe it. Her lawyer nodded. "The prosecutor's office reviewed your case, and with all the media exposure, they had no choice. Your sentence has been overturned, and you're officially free." The room around her seemed to spin. She had spent months suffocated by injustice, trapped in a reality that seemed inescapable. Now suddenly the doors were opening. But then a terrible thought struck her. What if it's a trap? What if Harrison still has tricks up his sleeve? As if reading her mind, her lawyer lightly touched her shoulder. He can't hurt you anymore, Sarah. The investigation against him has already started, and the more they discover, the worse it gets for him. You've won. The sound of doors unlocking thundered in her ears. When Sarah took her first step outside the prison, the sun hit her face, warm and bright. For the first time in months, she breathed deeply without feeling the crushing weight of fear on her chest. But before she could say anything, she heard voices calling her name. When she looked ahead, she saw her children, Malik, Ava, and Noah, running toward her. The air was knocked out of her lungs, and before she could prepare, the three threw themselves into her arms, crying and laughing at the same time. Sarah held them tight, as if she would never let go. There, surrounded by her children, feeling the warmth of their small bodies against hers, she finally understood. She was free. And this time, no one could take that away. Camera flashes erupted even before Sarah could pull away from her children. Journalists swarmed the prison exit, microphones out, questions flying from every direction. Sarah, how does it feel to be freed after such an injustice? What would you say to Judge Harrison now? Do you intend to sue the state? The lawyer raised his hand, trying to contain the chaos. But Sarah knew she had to speak. Still holding Malik and Ava by the hands, she took a deep breath and looked directly into the cameras. I am living proof that the system isn't made for everyone, she said, her voice firm yet laden with emotion. I was thrown in here because of an error that should never have happened. But how many other Sarahs are still trapped unjustly? How many don't have a lawyer fighting for them, a journalist willing to tell their stories? There was a moment of silence before the journalists began to scribble furiously. Sarah didn't want to be just another resolved case. She wanted her fight to mean something bigger. On the other side of the city, while Sarah was speaking, Judge Harrison watched the live broadcast from his office. His face, once impassive, now showed clear signs of tension. What began as yet another arbitrary sentence had become a national scandal. His political allies were distancing themselves, investigations were underway, and the career he had built on unjust rulings was starting to crumble. He clenched his fists, taking a deep breath, but it was too late. The truth had been exposed, and the system he had helped manipulate was now turning against him. Outside, protesters shouted slogans, demanding his removal. Sarah Thompson was no longer just a name in a case. She had become a symbol of resistance, and her story was only beginning. In the following days, Sarah Thompson's name was everywhere. Newspapers, television, social media, everyone was talking about the woman who had defied an unjust system and won. But for Sarah, true victory wasn't just about her freedom. It was in seeing that her struggle had awakened something greater. Civil rights organizations began reviewing cases similar to hers. Protests filled the streets, demanding judicial reform. Judge Harrison was temporarily suspended as investigations advanced, and with every new document uncovered, his downfall became inevitable. But Sarah didn't just want to watch him fall. She wanted to ensure that no one else had to endure what she did. So in her first official public appearance, she announced something that surprised everyone: the creation of a foundation to help victims of wrongful convictions. The decision caught many off guard. Some expected Sarah to simply move on with her life, away from the spotlight, trying to recover the lost time with her children. But she knew she couldn't just turn the page and pretend nothing happened. I don't want my story to be just a fleeting headline, she said at an event organized by activists. I want my freedom to mean something for those who are still fighting. The response was immediate. Lawyers, journalists, and human rights advocates volunteered to support the cause. More and more people began to speak out, bringing to light stories of injustices that had long been buried by the system. Sarah realized that her fight wasn't over. She was no longer just a survivor. She was an agent of change. One night, while watching her children sleep, Sarah felt for the first time in a long while a genuine sense of peace. The battle was far from over, but she had regained something the system had tried to steal from her: her voice. She walked to the window and gazed at the starry sky, letting the cool night breeze touch her face. She thought of all the people still inside, unjustly imprisoned, waiting for a miracle. I was someone's miracle, she thought. Now it was my turn to be someone else's miracle. With one last look at her children, she returned to the table where she was sketching plans for her foundation. Sarah knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but after everything she had endured, there was one thing no one could ever take from her: the determination to change the world.